Hello everyone, I am Duke and today's video is a short story set in Trench Crusade. In this story a new Antioch patrol has cordoned off a small town in the Levant. The Black Grail are here, but this is no usual strain of Beelzebub's plague and there is only one sure way to stop it. So if you enjoy this video, drop me a like and share it with a friend. Without further ado, let's head to the trenches. Rain spat down on them from the roiling bruise of a sky. The clouds themselves seemed to selfishly devour the daylight above them to cast an eerie dusk on the ground below. This wasn't exactly a normal storm. The rain fell sporadic in engorged globs that punched the ground with the impact of a liquid too thick to be adequately described as water. The air stank foul, like the inner bowels of a slaughterhouse waste disposal. He kept on his gas mask, taking it off would only make him want to vomit at the stench. The lethargic storm rain gave off a rat-a-tat echo as it slapped off his helmet. The sound reminded him of his grandfather's tool shed back home and the discordant percussion it played in the rain. They'd been here for weeks. A grail outbreak in the town had drawn his task force from New Antioch, and now the lieutenant's troops manned a tight cordon around its perimeter. Sniper shots had rung out into the air at every hour of the day for the first week and a half. If anything got too close, great gouts of fire would engulf it and leave nothing but a scorched wound on the fetid earth. This cordon had been erected after Butcher Knights strode out of the darkness on the first night and dragged a quarter of his men into the night as they made camp. Identifying this strain of the Black Grail as the Great Hunger, the cordon was erected quickly to contain the spread. If they could deny the creatures food and stall this strain here, its leadership would devolve into prowlers. The Great Hunger was far less tactically minded than others of the Order of the Fly, but its leadership were still grave tactical threats. The Great Hunger developed slower than other strains of the Black Grail, but it imbued its victims with a ravenous hunger unmatched by any other strain. If this hunger was not kept in check, then even the Great Maws would devolve into the hound-like prowlers. Before this devolution occurred, however, the Grail's forces would turn on each other in cannibalistic self-destruction, driven by the constant need to feed. As the Grail's forces devoured each other, the noose would begin to tighten. Moving in with flamers and holy water, the lieutenant's men would scourge the village clean before razing it to the ground to end the outbreak spread. But there was a problem. No Great Maw had yet been seen, nor had they discovered the Matagot Hag. If they could find the Matagot Hag, the linchpin of all Great Hunger forces, the Grail forces' supply of new troops would be ended. This would ultimately all but secure the cordon, denying the Great Hunger's forces the strength they needed to break through and speed up their extermination. A putrid, wet, slopping sound broke the silence of the lieutenant's thoughts, and he looked over at a runner approaching from a distant end of the trench line. Great splatters of fetid mud leapt up as the shock trooper ran through the filthy puddles of the trench, stopping a few feet from his commander. "Sir, we found it." The Matagot Hag was spotted by a scouting party. Only one of them made it back, and once he'd told us what he saw, the medic assessed his wounds. He was put to the flame out of mercy. The lieutenant barely reacted to the news that his men had burned a comrade alive, or at least he hoped they hadn't wasted a bullet first. In his youth this would have shocked him, but better that the man die now than slowly twist and corrupt into one of them. After receiving the news, he consulted his trench cleric. They decided that 3 heavy mechanized infantry, 2 sniper priests, the lieutenant, and a number of shock troopers would hunt down the Matagot Hag. Once they closed in on this foul creature, they would put it and its children to the flame before signalling the cleric to begin scourging the town street by street. One swift strike was all they needed. One swift strike and they could end it all tonight. The whir and grind of the heavy mechanized infantrymen was drowned out partly by the rain. The occasional crack of a sniper priest shot was hidden by the growl of thunder as it rumbled like a hungering stomach in the miasmic sky. They were closing in on the fortified church that the Matagot Hag had been spotted in. Sentries and lookouts dropped as the sniper priests got to work, and then when any thralls got close, the flamers of the heavy infantry reduced them to ash. Just as they got to the maggot-infested door, the old wood shattered into splinters as Butcher Knights burst from the bowels of the church. The heavy mechanized infantry were hit in a synchronized strike by prowlers, their once human forms reduced to all fours, and huge jaws of their ribcage maws snapped at the soldiers before they could unleash their flameless fury. With the mechanized infantry pinned down and fending off the prowlers, the shock troopers formed up around the lieutenant as they fought off the mass of grail thralls emerging from the darkness. The lieutenant glanced at the sniper nest as he drew his blade from a grail thrall's head, just in time to see the swarm of fly thralls rip the last priest in half. One of the mechanized heavy infantry fell, his head torn off by the chest maw of a prowler. Another took a knee as a butcher knight ran him through. As the infantryman died, he ignited his flame as fuel tank, and the explosion threw everyone to the ground. Dazed, the lieutenant shot a grail thrall, its disease-riddled body taking far too many shots to bring low. Hastily he reloaded, and the great whoosh of an enormous cleaver narrowly missed his head as a shock trooper parried the Great Maul's beheading strike. Chaos reigned, and shock troopers were being eaten alive as patches of fire set some of the grail thralls alight. The stink of burning, rotting flesh overwhelmed the shock trooper, who threw up. A swarm of flies descended on the vomit to devour it as a fly thrall dropped from the sky and bit a hole in the man's chest. The Great Maul threw the lieutenant's saviour to one side and his bones cracked as he hit the ground. Unflinching, the lieutenant ran the giant through with his sword. The Great Maul's gas mask turned feeding tube covered head tilted down to look at the wound, but before it could strike back, the lieutenant was engulfed in smoke and dragged backwards. Another shock trooper had lit a signal flare and then pulled the lieutenant away as the last of the heavy mechanized infantrymen engaged the Great Maul. With the lieutenant being dragged down the street, he fired at the advancing thralls. The throng was so thick now that it began to obscure his view of the dueling Great Maul and heavy mechanized infantrymen. As his view was slowly blocked, the lieutenant looked on in horror as his soldier's hammer smashed the Great Maul's left knee. Rather than felling the creature, the hammer embedded into the putrid flesh of the Great Maul's knee as it tore the man's ballistic shield out of his hands and lifted him into a great vice-like embrace. As they fled, they could hear the creak of metal straining and buckling under titanic pressure before the distinctive clang of shattering metal signalled the hull breach of the heavy mechanized armour, and the man finally stopped screaming. As they neared the cordon, it was not comrades who met them, but a scene akin to an explosion in a charnel house. The cordon lay in ruins, his men lay dead, and the lieutenant's mission had failed. As he and the shock trooper ran into the trench network to look for survivors, she was struck by a long-range shot and her chest ripped open by maggot-filled ammunition. Taking cover, the lieutenant dove into a nearby bunker. As he burst into the room, he was relieved to see the cleric was alive, but something was wrong. The cleric was laying recumbent on hastily torn open grain sacks, and as realization dawned on the lieutenant, the cleric's blood-soaked mouth smiled as he raised his pistol and fired.